I'm interested in your opinion of how it's taken us so long to think about what we eat as being a part of the solution, and that it's taken us so long to get here.
A couple of reasons. I think one is that there's been historically a bit of resistance in the medical community to acknowledge diet as a therapy. And I think that attitude has very much changed. And the FODMAP diet was actually the first well-evidenced diet supported by high-quality trials to show that it worked. So this is now one of many diets we use in the field of gastroenterology to treat people. And so that's one reason why there's been sort of a little bit of resistance, because in the medical community, we like evidence before we make recommendations rather than just feeling your own way.
I'm Jules Walters, a health coach for female leaders, helping you to become the CEO of your health. Yes, you got it. The Chief Executive Officer, the one who's in charge, the one who owns it. I've spent decades in healthcare as an entrepreneur and a CEO. And what I've learned is that many of the answers to a long and a healthy life are up to us. I'm a big believer in the power of women to adapt. Let's face it, we've done it before. As a health coach, I've seen many women make the journey from being frankly fed up and frustrated to being empowered and encouraged. They've done it by making small tweaks to their habits that together make all the difference. I call them Nano Health Habits, and I've written a book about it called Nano Health Habits. And these are small steps which, built one on top of the other, can transform our health. And that's what this podcast, The Health Refresh, is all about. If you're a busy woman who wants the best for herself and her family and is not prepared to accept that what you have now is as good as it gets, then you're in the right place. So welcome to the Health Refresh team. Today we're going to talk to one of the world's experts on FODMAPs, which are important for our gut health. And if you've never heard of FODMAPs, you're not alone. While it's a subject that's been gaining attention in health circles for the past 20 years, for most of us, it's still new. So I'm delighted that Emma Halmos can join us from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, which is the epicenter of FODMAPs research. So welcome to the Health Refresh, Emma.
Thanks for having me, Jules.
Well, great to meet you. And perhaps we could start with you just telling us a little bit about your background, your training, and what got you interested in FODMAPs.
So I'm a dietitian by trade. I worked for a long time clinically, and I accidentally fell into research and fell in love with research. I work in gastroenterology. I have a big interest in gastrointestinal conditions. And I guess even before then, I really got into dietetics because first and foremost, I love food, eating it, and as well as learning about it. And I think secretly every dietitian has a love of gastroenterology because this is the crux of everything that we eat. So I came to Monash University in 2008 and was involved with the initial pivotal studies to show that a low FODMAP diet was therapeutic for people with irritable bowel syndrome. And it's just sort of stayed in that area since then.
And so for people who are hearing about FODMAPs for the first time, how would you describe it to normal people, so normal humans who know they have a gut, but that's about it?
Okay, so FODMAPs is an umbrella term that we describe short-chain carbohydrates, or otherwise known as fermentable fibres. So these are things that are delivered to the large intestine, go all the way through the gut. And for an average person, they're fantastic. They're lovely. We also call them prebiotics, which makes it sound very good and healthy and exotic, which it is. So FODMAPs are really wonderful and healthy, we think, for long-term gut health. However, my research here at Monash University and research since then has shown that this term FODMAPs, when we reduce not one but all of the FODMAPs collectively, what it does is it improves symptoms in those people who have irritable bowel syndrome. So a low FODMAP diet, it's not a healthy diet, it's a therapeutic diet that we give to people with irritable bowel syndrome.
And so is it for people with irritable bowel syndrome rather than just the general population? Is that right? Yes. That's where it really comes into play?
Exactly, yeah. So people with irritable bowel syndrome, a large percentage of them have something called visceral hypersensitivity, which is a very fancy way of saying the nerves inside the large intestine are sensitive. And instead of, like most of us, getting a bellyache after, say, a 10-course meal, people with irritable bowel syndrome might get symptoms after one course or even just day-to-day normal changes in the gut. And so low FODMAP diet was a way to try and control those symptoms just in those people who have irritable bowel syndrome. But because they're healthy, there's no need to restrict them if you don't have irritable bowel syndrome.
Right. And in my research for our conversation today, I was having a look at the definition of irritable bowel syndrome, and it seems to be quite broad. So perhaps you could give us the professional definition. If someone's just feeling a bit uncomfortable, but it's quite often, could that be IBS?
It could be. So actually, irritable bowel syndrome is very, very common. In Australia, the prevalence is about 10%. So 1 in 10 people have irritable bowel, and that's very similar in the States, in UK, and various other places.
Yeah, so on that point, so how do I know if I might have irritable bowel syndrome?
If you exhibit symptoms of lower abdominal pain, and it's often coupled with bloating, diarrhea, and or constipation, these are symptoms that could be irritable bowel syndrome. They also could be many other symptoms, could represent many other gut conditions as well. So it's super important that you get diagnosed properly through a doctor.
And so when we're talking about foods that might be what we call low FODMAP, what are we actually talking about? What kind of foods are in that kind of, you start to eliminate them? Is that right?
Yeah. So, well, actually, it's sort of individual, and there is a process to find your level of restriction of FODMAPs that suits you. But FODMAPs are things that are found pretty widely across the food supply. We can't find them in certain fruits like apples and pears, certain vegetables such as onion, garlic, and legumes, pulses. We find them in milk and milk products. We call them lactose in milk and milk products. And we find them in grains as well, such as wheat. But the good thing about a low FODMAP diet is that there are suitable alternatives in each of those food groups that you can apply. So low FODMAP diet is usually applied temporarily for someone with irritable bowel syndrome, but it doesn't mean it needs to compromise, say, nutrition or fun part of eating.
And so when we're talking about things that are high FODMAP, so things like apples and pears and wheat, what is it about those kind of foods that can cause an irritation?
So these foods are very healthy for us. They have lots of nutrients that are important, but they also have FODMAPs in them. And FODMAPs are things that are delivered to the large intestines, and when they reach the large intestines, they produce a huge, huge amount of gas. It is a healthy gas, but is nonetheless a gas. So it produces gas very quickly, and it also draws or attracts water through the gut. And in a healthy person, this is not a big deal. But in someone with sensitive gut or irritable bowel syndrome, that can exacerbate or induce the symptoms of bloating, pain, discomfort, diarrhea, constipation. So what we try and do with a FODMAP diet is to reduce it to the level that's necessary for that person. And that's different person to person.
So on the whole, how long do people kind of stay on a low FODMAP in your experience?
Most people, if done sort of well and correctly, and I would very much advocate doing this in conjunction with or in guidance with a dietitian who's well versed in the area, you could go down a protocol of perhaps short-term over-restricting the FODMAPs, going on an elimination type diet, usually for a few weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, something like that. And then path of reintroducing FODMAPs, really just to gather which foods can be tolerated well. And then over time, what can happen is that we try and ultimately achieve the minimum restriction that's necessary for the person. And the vast majority with irritable bowel syndrome end up on, if you like, a medium FODMAP diet where there is some flexibility. So perhaps they don't have apples and pears, but they can have milk, no problem. And maybe they only restrict onion at home and eat it freely when they're out.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm interested in your opinion of how it's taken us so long to think about what we eat as being a part of the solution, and that it's taken us so long to get here.
Yeah. A couple of reasons. I think one is that there's been historically a bit of resistance in the medical community to acknowledge diet as a therapy. And I think that attitude has very much changed. And the FODMAP diet was the first well-evidenced diet supported by high-quality trials to show that it worked. So this is now one of many diets we use in the field of gastroenterology to treat people. And so that's one reason why there's been sort of a little bit of resistance, because in the medical community, we like evidence before we make recommendations rather than just feeling your own way.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And you've been part of building that evidence base, Emma. So what are the kind of stark findings from your experience in this field over the past 20 years?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I was part of the initial studies to look at a low FODMAP diet and how it worked. And we are very lucky here at Monash University that we've got access to research chefs and big industrial kitchens and dietitians like myself who very carefully design diets. So we can execute a study that's super well controlled, meaning that we can design it so that it's only the FODMAPs that we're looking at and not other fibres or proteins or carbohydrates or things like that. And this study showed that it was the low FODMAP diet that improved symptoms in about 3/4 of people with irritable bowel syndrome over matched diet for all components except FODMAPs. And since then, this is not just work that Monash do. There's been studies that have been similar, conducted in the States, in the UK, across Asian countries, really all over the globe. And so now it's acknowledged in our IBS clinical guidelines globally that this is the first dietary therapy that we'd apply for people with irritable bowel syndrome.
That's pretty extraordinary to get 3/4 of the people in the study to actually respond well.
Yeah, if it was a drug, it'd be called a wonder drug.
Yes, but it's just food.
Yeah, it's food, yeah.
It's just food. And so if people are listening and they're thinking, I wonder if that might be right for me, what kind of guidance would you have for them? What's the first step that they should take?
Well, first and foremost, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you go and visit your GP. And the reason being is because these symptoms that I described of irritable bowel syndrome are kind of non-specific. So you could have similar conditions, or other conditions that may actually be delayed in diagnosis if you start self-diagnosing. So you need to go to your GP to get checked for things like celiac disease or inflammatory bowel disease, and even gynecological conditions can present the same way. So we've got to firstly really get that diagnosis right. Once you have a diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome, then what I would say is try and find a dietitian well-versed in the area and work through FODMAP diet with them. Unfortunately, the access to dietitian across the globe is variable and not everyone has access to a good dietitian. And if that's the case in you, then there are other resources that can be used. Monash University have an app and there are various other places that you can go. But I think it's really best for a dietitian so the therapy can be tailored to the person.
That's great guidance. And what would you say to, women are often particularly dismissed by doctors, have a lot of experience of women being dismissed. If their primary care or general practitioner says, I think you should just carry on and see how you get on, what guidance would you have for them to advocate for themselves?
Yeah. So this is really challenging. And I think a diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome is sometimes compounds that issue. And the reason being is because we don't have any biomarker for it. So if you go to a GP and your GP says, here's a blood test showing you've got celiac disease, or here's a stool test that shows that you've probably got an inflammatory bowel condition, that's very apparent, whereas we don't have such tests for irritable bowel syndrome. That doesn't mean it's not equally as important to be diagnosed. So very commonly we can get health professionals saying, it's just irritable bowel syndrome, off you go. And that's not very helpful. Irritable bowel syndrome can have huge impacts on quality of life and contribute to absenteeism from work and things like that. Thankfully, I think the landscape is changing, and because we've got treatments and because the knowledge is better over time, many doctors do accept that irritable bowel syndrome is a real condition and needs that real confirmation and diagnosis. So if you have a GP who perhaps is not listening, you go to another one.
Yes, that's always a second opinion is always a good option. And then ideally you'll end up with a dietitian who can guide and advise. And in your experience, are FODMAPs more well known in Australia where it started compared to the rest of the Western world?
This is where it started. So yes, it was born here, and the knowledge of FODMAPs really is pretty good in Australia. But actually there's been work from King's College in London. There's been work from Michigan in the US. And one of the things we do at Monash is that we do a bit of a tour. And just last year we went to the Monash University in Malaysia to disseminate information about FODMAPs and generally diet and gastroenterology research. Last year it was Asia. We've been to Italy a few times as well to really sort of spread the word that this happens not just with conferences but also with research and publications as well. So it is expanding and spreading through the globe. So I think in the world of gastroenterology, I feel like if you're a gastroenterologist and you never heard of the word FODMAPs, you'd be living under a rock, really. But this is slowly coming into all aspects, not just gastroenterology.
Yeah. So ideally find a clinician who's heard of it, start.
Yeah.
And then in your expertise of the last 20 years, Emma, what would you say has changed or modified? I read something about the Mediterranean diet, with FODMAPs. Is there anything that we've learned in the last few years that we didn't know at the beginning?
Certainly. The thing about FODMAPs and FODMAP research is it's being investigated in other conditions such as inflammatory bowel disease and more recently in endometriosis as well. The other thing we know about irritable bowel syndrome, just like other conditions, is that the FODMAP diet is not the cause and it's not the cure. It is a treatment for irritable bowel syndrome, and it works for 3/4 of people with irritable bowel, which means that 1/4 of people with irritable bowel it does not work for. So if it doesn't work for you, what's good is that we actually have other therapies for irritable bowel syndrome which may be better suited. This can be dietary, such as a Mediterranean diet, or it could be non-dietary. Our group is very interested and has done a lot of work in gut-directed hypnotherapy, which has also been done in the States as well, which has really good efficacy or works well for irritable bowel as well. There are drug therapies that can also have benefits in irritable bowel, although not as promising as what the dietary and the psychological data tells us.
Yeah. And just picking up on that point about endometriosis, because women with that condition have similarly had perhaps many years of symptoms going unrecognized as to what the cause is. So what do we know so far about endometriosis and FODMAPs? What's the crossover there?
So there is absolutely a crossover. There's a crossover between endometriosis and irritable bowel syndrome. There are twice as many women with irritable bowel than men. And if you look at the onset, there is common increase in prevalence around puberty time and then again at menopause time. So we know there is some sort of hormonal impact on people with irritable bowel syndrome. We don't really know exactly how, but when we do studies to look at the overlap between the prevalence of irritable bowel syndrome and endometriosis, there is definitely people who have more commonly both. And there have been studies that have looked at a low FODMAP diet treating gut symptoms in endometriosis. You can appreciate that sometimes it's very difficult to get the confirmed diagnosis of endometriosis, but this is sort of an area of research that we need more in and is emerging, but there is absolutely an overlap between the two conditions.
And then just finally, Emma, what's your hope for the next kind of decade with FODMAPs? What would you personally like to see in terms of uptake or research? Like, where would you like to take the field?
We're constantly doing research in the area of gut and FODMAPs. FODMAPs, started with us. I am very interested in looking at ways of reducing the burden of a low FODMAP diet. And I have published reviews and initial things talking about a concept of a FODMAP gentle diet, which is lesser restrictive, low FODMAP diet version, but we haven't done the studies in that yet. That's sort of purely based on our clinical experience and what us dietitians use with our patients. So that's one area that's interesting. And I think there are various other things that we can look at to try and reduce how difficult a FODMAP diet can be.
Yeah, understood. Well, thank you so much, Emma, for spending some time with us today. And congratulations on your work and your continuing commitment to the field. And I hope everyone's learned something today and you know where to go to help. It's been very clear. So thank you very much for your time today, Emma. So that's it for this week. Before we go, I do need to make clear, if I haven't already, that I am not a doctor. I'm a health coach, and my lane is lifestyle and how it affects our health. If you have a medical condition or suspect you might be developing one, then a doctor is the right person to see. So that's the legal bit done. In the next episode, we'll be diving into more examples of how our environment, including what we eat, how we move, how we exercise, and our DNA, combine to create our health. So see you right here, same time, same place.